Hey gamers, welcome to Vlog Matters number 10. I'm going to start this vlog by talking about our new Project Torment concept page over there on Steam Greenlight. You can find the link to that down in the description below, and follow that and like us, follow us, thumbs up it, whatever you have to do over there. Leave us a comment and let us know what you think about Project Torment over there on Steam Greenlight concept. Now I'm going to go from that into talking about how that concept changed what we're working on right now and the bigger picture of the current state of the project. So if you are on Steam Greenlight and this is the first time you've seen one of our subject matter vlogs, I am Matt. I'm the creative director of Subject Matter Games and the primary developer. And yeah, I do these little vlogs and talk about some of the stuff that's going on in development for Subject Matter and the projects we're working on. So back to how Steam Greenlight concept changed a little bit of the overarching plan and how that'll change as we go into production of the actual Project Torment game. So right now we're in what I would call pre-production, and what I'm doing right now is working on some of the concept and design work that goes with building the game, but not necessarily putting that stuff in the game engine right now. So a lot of documenting, concept art, stuff like that. That stuff's kind of getting towards the tail end, and as that reached the tail end of writing those documents, I took those documents and I sent them to a couple people that I know, and actually some people that I don't know. A couple of YouTube content creators or video voiceover guys that do videos on YouTube related to specifically the Steam Greenlight stuff, and then around some of the horror stuff. And I sent them the concept page and kind of explained a little bit about the project, and I said, you know, what do you think? What should I change? Give me some constructive criticism. And I got a bunch of constructive criticism. Little note here, maybe not the best to send like your early concept stuff to reviewers strictly right away, and say, you know, kind of review my concept, but their input is still very valid in how you should look at changing your product, especially in this pre-production phase, right? So pre-production is the point where you can make these drastic changes, I think, to the design of the game and have that impact the development without having to go and rewrite and retool all the stuff that's already built. I mean, you can go and retool the stuff that's already built in the document, but it's a lot easier to change a word in a document than to go to level 4 and then like have to explode this whole like area because it's too small, and the constructive criticism said that, you know, the sizing was too, you know, weird or something like that. I didn't get anything like that. The constructive criticism I got strictly from some of the people that I asked about it was, I'm going to grab my notes here quick. So I broke them down into 3 core areas. There's design criticisms, there's story criticisms, and technical criticism, right? So design criticisms are those things where they impact the gameplay in terms of how the player is going to be playing and interacting. Things like, let's say, the number of bullets that you have in this document that it says comes out of this machine gun doesn't seem like it's enough, or something like that. Something that when you change the design of it, it's going to really impact the implementation of it. Whereas something like a story criticism is like, oh, there's a plot hole here. Well, that plot hole you can patch up, and you're still going to have to put the fix into the final engine, but it's strictly related to what the story is that you're telling the player and how you're telling it to the player, which kind of overlaps. There's kind of a fine line between all of these. You kind of have to make a decision in some of these cases. Some of them are story criticisms that border on design. Some of them are design that border on technical, and then some are the other ones, story that borders on technical. In the case of something like, let's say, Portal, where it's got those notes around the walls of the game that kind of tell you the story. So that touches on all 3 of these, right? The story is what you're telling, but you're using the design to tell the technical component, this is how we're going to tell the story, and then the technical component is just putting that stuff on the walls and explaining it. So what I did is I took those criticisms. First, I just wrote them all down on a yellow pad. Went through them once, said, is it design, story, or technical? And then after I figured it was one of those three, I ordered it from 1 to 3. 1 being high importance, 1 being medium importance, and 1 being low. Not meaning that low isn't going to be worked on or fixed or anything, but low is sometimes some things like clunky animations or something based on seeing the demo that was the concept video that was put out there. So yeah, stuff like the animations are clunky, and I know that was always intended to be fixed as we go into actual production. This is just using some base animations right now. So that's stuff that's low right now because it's not something I need to address here in pre-production and fix later on. I can just do that from the start of production, work on those animations. So let's talk about some of the top design, story, and technical criticisms that are in the project, or that Project Torment received. So in terms of design, the one major design criticism, well, let's skip that one and go to a different one because that one's got some more discussion around it that I want to bring up later. Let's go to the story criticisms. So also after I should mention this first. After I went from 1 to 3, rating all of them, I went through all the designs, rated them 1 to 3, high, medium, low. And then after I rated them high, medium, and low, some of them were like multiple were marked 2, marked medium. So then I took those mediums and I applied that same 1, 2, 3 to them, which ones are the highest and lowest of those 2s. So there's kind of a multiple ordering here. But the story criticism, the first main one is that the Depro in terms of the story, it's kind of muddled, I think. Some of the criticism was that it seems like there's 2 stories going on. There's a story that's being explained to the player that's kind of around the main character, and then there's this stuff with the Depro, and there needs to be a connection there, and I don't think that connection is strong enough right now. It needs to be explained a little better. So in some cases it feels like Depro, which is going to be used as a game mechanic, is somewhat irrelevant. So if it's irrelevant to the story and it's useful in certain cases of the game but not all cases, it seems like that Depro could be irrelevant, and it could be causing some stuff in the game by players assuming that Depro is making, this horror stuff happen or something like that, where in reality it's actually not behind the scenes. So to try and explain that without saying, hey, this medication you're taking isn't the cause of all this other stuff you're seeing. So it's almost like the criticism was reading into the design a little closer, which is something that one of the other things that was just a tip, that you kind of read online, is that you shouldn't underestimate the player's sense of understanding. And I think that leads into some of the other criticisms around amount of story being told to the player and the amount of stuff being shown to the player. I hate this in video games where you go into an area and you see you get into a brand new area and it's a huge area, and as soon as you enter that, the game triggers some kind of invisible trigger that takes you out of that player, takes a camera cutscene and goes through the level and says, this is where you go. You go up these stairs and you go up this elevator, and that is really annoying. You want to explore. So I didn't have anything like that, but I think in terms of story, you have to think the same way. I think you have to develop the story to tell the player things with them being able to read into it and explore from strictly like a mental point of view, a mental exploration of how the story is and what's happening in the game, and how the design and the story is related, and how the design is trying to tell the story itself, right, through the usage of game mechanics and stuff like that. As we go on to technical criticisms, those ones are probably, I would say, the easiest to fix right now, especially considering the stuff that's in there is pretty dynamic in terms of having to change something, and it's also not the final code base. So all this stuff was built in a gameplay project, and I'm going to basically take a new project and take the things that result from that and put it in this new project. So one of the highest technical criticisms was that the camera angle is a little, it's too open in some cases, making it less scary. And that the character fills the center of the screen where the player wants to look, okay? So let's take those in as two parts. The first one where the camera angle is too open. So I think in some cases I understand that, especially if you look at games like Silent Hill, which is a huge inspiration for this project. Your camera angle is like, especially outdoors, is a behind the character and then high up character, or high above the character. So you're kind of looking down, but you're seeing everything in front up to the point where the fog starts, and you're seeing behind the character a little bit, which can serve two positive. It can serve a positive and a negative. You can see enemies coming up behind you, which isn't as necessarily scary because you can see, oh, this guy's creeping up behind me, rather than a first-person view where all of a sudden you're taking damage and there's some noise happening. But at a design level, I think it also says, hey, watch out, you've got something coming behind you. It gives you a little more of a heads up, which may not necessarily be the best thing for a horror game, but I also don't want it to be unfairly dropping. Okay, camera's back. I don't want it to be unfairly dropping things behind you that you can't see and just being like, oh, boo, fight this thing. I don't really enjoy that. But I do think the second part of this is probably the bigger technical criticism to take away from this, is the character fills the center of the screen where the player wants to look. In the outdoor scenes, I don't think that's as much of an issue because it's such a higher up camera. But I think when you're indoors, that's been a big struggle through this entire first part of this pre-production demo, is that when you go indoors, the height of the door needs to be a certain height so it looks right when the player is standing next to it. Same thing with all the walls in the game. If you stand next to a wall, you can tell, and this was, I think I tweeted something about this, is if you walk up to a wall in a game and the wall just goes on, it's huge, and there's a door there, and the door is either ginormous because the texture is stretched, or it's really small because the texture is compressed onto that thing. The sense of scale doesn't stick with it. So I did a lot of work around keeping that sense of scale with walls and doors and ceiling heights. And then you realize the technical restrictions around that, because if you have a ceiling that is so much higher than the player, right, the camera only has a little bit of area to maneuver, especially if it's above and behind. So you'll notice in that original demo that the camera kind of pulls back a little bit, and it's a little lower than when you're outside, but it doesn't go left or right, so the player's right in the center. And then when you walk into something, there's a bounding volume around the camera. So when the camera is like bumping up against the ceiling or walls, it kind of it gets that collision and it moves. If this was the player, it moves towards the player. So as you walk into new rooms and stuff, and you go through that doorway that's only basically as big as the player, you'll hit one of those doorway things and then zoom into the player, and then you've got that big player head right in your field of view. So kind of the solution to that, and that's what I worked on this morning a little bit, was taking that camera and doing kind of a side shoulder cam, kind of Resident Evil 4 style, kind of Gears of War, that kind of thing, where it's an offset camera. Your player's here, and you're kind of looking next to the player, and then your volume or your screen window is like that, where the player is kind of off to the left, and that's kind of like basic camera and scene setup. You can see I do it here. I'm kind of on this side of the camera, and then there's all this open space. So just imagine this, but me turned around kind of. So there's some work to do there around the distance you have to be from the player. Is the player too big? Should the Y distance of the camera be right behind, kind of the head level, eye level? Should it be higher or lower? And there's going to be some work there around checking references with other horror games to see what they do. But I think that's really, really useful criticism. I already put it in, and the basic version of it seems pretty good, pretty useful. When you walk into those rooms, you don't get that thing where the camera comes up and all you see is that guy's noggin right in the window. So let's go on to the design criticism to kind of wrap this thing up. And the number one design criticism was that there was not one main mechanic. So this is a little bit of a tough one, and this is the one that I'm working on mentally kind of right now. Most games have a core mechanic, and then that core mechanic has things built off of them. And I found this really good article that discusses how to build a core mechanic and build off of it. And I'll put like some of the image over here. It's basically like you build a core mechanic, you add to that mechanic, add, and eventually you get to the point where jumping between the layers of mechanics and narrative are tied, and they're basically interdependent. So I'd like to do something like that, but at the same time I'm using Silent Hill and the original Resident Evil games, more of Silent Hill, but to be inspirations for this game and for its mechanics. So if you look at the original Silent Hill, it's really gray when you think of the core mechanic. Something like Bioshock, it's really easy to say, oh, the core mechanic is shooting. A secondary mechanic on top of the shooting could be the vigors in Bioshock Infinite, because you can, it modifies the shooting aspect of it. Well, when you look at a game like Silent Hill, especially the first ones, your core mechanic isn't necessarily combat, because they only give you a certain amount of ammo to use when you're in combat, not counting melee weapons and stuff. So if you consider combat your core mechanic there, your secondary mechanic where you are impacting the original mechanic is don't give them as much ammo, which kind of cuts away from your core mechanic. So then the other mechanic that's kind of big in Silent Hill games is just simply running around. Well, then your core mechanic is run, but your secondary, what's your secondary other than just to explore and then pick up items, I guess would maybe be your secondary, and then on top of that use those items in puzzles. So it's kind of hard to think of what a core mechanic for a narrative-driven third-person horror game would be, especially when you look at those early examples, because I think that's some of the draw to those games, is that they're not necessarily centered around doing this one action over and over. I think they're more like, rather than having a core mechanic, I think their core mechanic is the level, the environment, and the tension the environment applies to the player is more of the core mechanic, because the reason most horror fans play horror games is because they enjoy the not the jump scares, but they enjoy the scares that make them jump or feel unnerved. So that's kind of the core mechanic, I think, to a horror game. It's just a matter of how do you get that into your design doc and then have stuff on top of it. It's hard to play off of, oh, the environment is scary, other than having the player do, kind of secondary things. So you don't want the player to feel like everything they're doing is a secondary mechanic and not realizing that core mechanic. So, in summary, that is all of the top-level criticisms that I'm working through right now. Once pre-production is done, once I do take these criticisms, apply them to the design document, kind of finish that up, get some concept art finished, get some overarching level maps finished, I can go into actual full production, which is working on the game completely, the final product, working on the levels, tweaking some of the designs, getting those items and all that code and stuff in there. And I think that's going to be a big chunk of the work, but I don't want to have this early plan not done before I go into full production. So head over to that Steam Greenlight concept page if you haven't already, and leave a comment down below that and let us know what you want to see in the game. You can find that link again in the description below, and I'll see you next time.